Well, thank you both. I mean, it's fascinating to see the differences and similarities.
Yep.
I mean, one thing that comes to mind immediately, and of course this is always a discussion in planning, is do you start with the transportation and work up to the land use, or do you start to the land use and you sort of figure out the transportation afterward? And your two applications kind of move at that from different directions. Any thoughts about why you went from took one approach versus another?
Well, I don't. If you want.
Because he's a transportation.
Yeah,
planner.
yeah. Well, so what are the advantages and disadvantages of that?
I am, but
Yeah.
I've actually done a lot of land use modeling and forecasting in my career for cities like Los Angeles, Minneapolis, Boston, at the regional level.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that you run into is a lot of skepticism about our ability to do that. Certainly, because we're transportation planners, we can actually understand the value of transportation access to all of these different agents that cooperate and interact in a regional economy. And certainly we can estimate sensitivities and things like that and run that model forward in time and look at impacts to regional performance measures. And that can inform a plan.
Right.
But then when it comes time for plan implementation, all of this goes down to the local level, right? The regional agencies, the state agencies, are relying on the local governments actually cooperating with them through a 3C process to get things moving towards their performance goals. And the federal government has sketched out a performance-based planning process, MAP 21, that is supposed to do that. But it only affects the metropolitan level. So if our plan implementation is all at the local level, and they really are not that beholden to these kinds of, because only 5% on average of local government comes from federal sources.
Right.
So they're not required to follow that process.
Right.
So at the end of the day, you really, we can model and we can forecast land use and try to predict what local governments are going to do, or instead we can take a more sort of measuring approach and showing them the value of accessibility and getting them to kind of think from within that game, kind of inside the matrix, actually affecting what people do by showing them the value of accessibility, which really ties land use and transportation together. So it's not just one or the other.
Yeah, it's not an either or. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting to think about. One of the tools that we have now in California is that there is this SB 375, Senate Bill 375, that's required every region to put together we could basically call a sustainability plan that is linked to transportation investment. And the very interesting that's happened, particularly in California, land use control does rest only at the local level, but almost every region has built its plan using a compilation of the local plans. And so I think it points back to the fact that transportation and land use, the way you plan them is always an iterative process, and that you have to both consider what are the current demands being placed on the transportation infrastructure due to existing land use, what would be the future desires based on future land use, but then if you build a set of transportation improvements, how's that going to go back and change the way the demands and the patterns that create land use? And so you see this iterative process, and you're also seeing an interaction between the region and the local government through that SB 375 Sustainability Action Plan process to create a slightly more rational system of planning.
Sure. I'm also quite interested in how these tools you've been developing affect the planning process. I mean, particularly with yours, David. I mean, you're really giving tools to the public, and how has that changed planning decisions, and also how have you seen that, Colby?
Well, what we see, and it's really interesting to me. I mean, there's a certain degree that, and I say this in no disrespect to any of us, but there's a certain degree to which the tools that we're creating only make clear the connections that I think those of us who are professionally trained as planners already knew. But the lay public, which includes all the decision makers, never understood those things. And for them to be able to sit at a computer screen and change the map and see the dial change or see the graph go up and down, that's incredibly important for them. And that's been one of the biggest lessons of my career, because I look at it and I'm like, well, of course, you added some more offices, the number of jobs went up. That doesn't that's not rocket science, right?
Right.
I know there are rocket scientists here, so I should be careful what I say. But
Sorry, Noel.
but for a number of lay people, again, including the decision makers, those interconnections aren't so clear. And so
Yeah.
being able to have this tool where and there are, of course, a lot of more complicated interactions where they can then see, oh, I made this set of land use changes, and I have these 4 indicators that are important to me, and they all changed in the direction I want to go. I got less traffic, I got
Right.
more jobs, I got more parks preserved, I got better city income. Of course I want to do that.
Right.
And so it makes that whole planning process much more rational, to
Right.
use the word, because it does give them, and you talked about this too, Colby, that they suddenly see this map and they're like, oh, well, why did we designate the bike routes there? That was the exact opposite of what we should have done.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree 100%. I mean, just having the technology to distribute maps and visualizations of data so broadly and to anybody really, and that we use that in that interaction with that volunteer committee because they don't have GIS software, and otherwise it would be just confined to the town's GIS people. So it was nice to bring a printed out map, but even better to email a link to them over their Christmas vacation and get the reaction. And the public's perception of the value of data and analysis has changed so much due to broader changes in the economy, in society, that are linked to the rise of big data analytics. So many industries, so many businesses now use business intelligence and predictive analytics to drive everything they do, and these changes are being publicized in the media in a huge way. So part of the problem before was there was immense skepticism of technocratic planning that was happening
Right.
at planning agencies, driven by data, using models that the public did not understand and had no way of understanding because the distribution, the communication means were not there. What's happening now is it's possible to do what you're describing, partly because the level of discourse in the public is increasing, it's rising, about what data is, what GIS is, what maps can do, and even just the idea of playing out scenarios and doing that kind of scientific planning process is so much more top of mind in the public now than it was before.
Yeah, and the consequences are real time. I mean, so you see what everything.
And I think again, where we are right now, and I see this really changing right now, but where we are right now is it's mostly reactive. It's that I had these 3 alternatives, I made a couple changes, I saw the dials change. Where we're going to be within a year or so is that everybody's going to be able to sit at home and build their own alternative. And so, for this whole city, you've got thousands of parcels, and people are going to come back in and say, well, I sat at my computer and I played with this, and here's my preferred alternative. And honestly, the thing we're struggling with in our office right now is, so if we're going to have 100 people who each create their own preferred alternative, how are we going to analyze and redistribute these 100 alternatives to get back to the one that everyone can consensus on as the best? And I think, we're looking for ESRI for a lot of help in weight-arrested analysis and things like that, where we're going to be able then to say, well, out of our 100 alternatives, we had 90 that did this in this area, and so that's probably the thing that makes the most sense for the community as a whole. And over here, there were actually 4 different things that each got 25 votes, so to speak, and so this is one where the city council is really going to have to study it and make a policy decision because there's a less clear decision. But we're right on the cusp of this very important change where rather than us saying, here's your 3 alternatives, now talk among yourselves, it's going to be every one of our members of their public is going to have their own alternative that they got to build using the software.
Right, yeah, fascinating. In a way, Carl, this brought up, maybe you want to jump in here, Carl, because sort of following on the conversation Carl and Noel have had, there's this idea of how do we sort of begin to map agreement? I mean, and so of these 100 schemes that come from the public, what are the areas where there's 100% agreement or 50 or not much? So, Carl, maybe you want to jump in.
No, I can do that for me. I think we have talked about that. Those of you who saw my talk last night, I mean, there are groups that have tools to do that and to do it in a reasonably comprehensible way to get the 1,000 designs. And it's more like 1,000 to 10,000. And then the question of how do you actually develop one design or maybe some alternatives from that? That is a combination of infrastructure decisions and a probabilistic approach. Because you can't tell everybody what to do on their piece of property.
Right. Yeah.
And experimenting with what that kind of a plan looks like, let alone how the hell you get there, is what's likely to be a lot of interesting work in the next short amount of time, because I know that we're thinking about how to do that, and so are others. Noel, there you go.
Noel?
Noel Cressy, University of Wollongong. This is really important because I think Carl calls them requirements, but the notion that there are different I call them utility functions that somehow or other have to be incorporated. And I do know about some technical ways to do that, and part of my research program in the next year or so is to explore those. Some of you may know about principal components analysis. The psychologists have their own version of that, so what I'm trying to say is PCA is not only used by rocket scientists, but it's also used by the softer social sciences. And that is an attempt to take multivariate, in this case, utility functions, and find out what is common about them and what is not common about them. And the common things you generally can get consensus and agree on, and not use a lot of resources by arguing about things that people generally do agree on, and then work up the things that you don't agree on, and at least agree to disagree, and hopefully do that in a very polite and gentle way, but that's another story. So these notions of multivariate analysis and principal component analysis offer potential in the domain of decision theory. That's what I'd like to add.
Any thoughts about this new world of planning that these tools are bringing on?
It's so exciting to see so many different people in planning working with technology. And that was the thing that occurred to me during David's presentation. It's just so exciting, because I've been going to the American Planning Association meetings for a number of years to maintain my certification and all that, and the thing is, it was not always that there were so many companies using technology and using geographic information systems in the way that they are now to build interactive applications. It's been a real revolution, hasn't it?
It's absolutely, it's a revolution, yeah. And I mean, we've seen, and it's working in an exponential way, right? So it took a long time to do that first ramping up, but now, just over these last couple of years, we're seeing a huge increase, and I think it's gonna continue to exponentially increase, so that what we're doing, I think, in 5 years will be hardly recognizable from what we're doing today, whereas what we're doing today is not terribly different from what we were doing 15 or 20 years ago.
It's just mobile and accessible.
It's the mobile, it's the fact that Esri has, and all of Geodesign has now really moved to a place where these tools are here. And a lot of the, the things that those of us in sort of scenario land use planning and urban design planning, transportation, all those that we've hoped to be able to do in a workshop setting or in a sort of sketch setting, it really is possible now.
Right.
And it wasn't just a few years ago.
Yeah. Let's bring the audience into this. Yes, right here. Oh, yeah.
Thanks. As software developers, essentially, have you been tracking any other companies and what they're doing and how that may, in turn, affect what you're developing? So, for example, if Google's working on some new crowdsourcing element, that may play into how you modify your softwares or parallel it in some way. Is there anything that you're tracking that you think may influence what you're doing?
Well, that's a great example. The Google example is not that abstract for us. We did a survey of the best sources of information on transit schedules and routes, and we found that the best source is actually the crowdsourced one, hosted in fact by Google, by providing the Google, it's now called the General Transit Feed Specification, but it's a format that really provides a common denominator for all the transit agencies to publish their schedule, route, and bus stop information and transit station information. And it's such a flexible standard because it really doesn't have all the bells and whistles. And it's interesting because we looked at some of the European standards at the same time, and there's like 1,000-page long manuals on the standard and the data model and how it all fits together. And it's supposed to be European-wide, but it's really just one country. Whereas you contrast that with in the US, it's just very quickly over the past 5-10 years, the GTFS format became the standard, and there were portals put up for sharing the data. And open data is such a revelation too that makes so many of these applications possible. So we just hook into that standard, and really we don't interface directly with Google, but they provide a platform for that. But what we're doing with it is then bringing it into Esri's ArcGIS platform in a geodatabase format that's topologically aware and works with the terrific editing workflow that ArcGIS provides, so that people can geodesign and sketch up their own modifications to routes and schedules and things like that, because that's really key, then taking it down to this local level where people understand the decisions that are in front of them. So anything on that?
Well, I want to appreciate you for thinking I'm a software developer. I'm really not, so I don't know if I can answer that. I mean, Dan or Robert might be able to if you catch us at the break. But what I would say about this is what I'm observing about this whole industry and profession is a very interesting simultaneously that we're competing with each other to some degree. So we are watching very closely. As we develop our online engagement platform, there are competitors in the marketplace, and we're very interested in what they're doing, and we're learning from them, and we're sort of trying to figure out what they're doing and what they did, and then do it even a step better. And I know then they're looking at us and they're doing that thing. So we're ratcheting each other up, and I think that's kind of typical. It's happening more quickly, I think, than it used to because of technology, but I think that kind of thing has always happened. But at the same time, there's this open source nature of what's happening that is very different from, I think, any time in our sort of capitalist past, that we do take data happily and we give data to others. And the whole way that Esri works, that we're all sitting here sharing all our ideas, and that all of these ideas are being made available to us in a non-competitive, non-cost-based format, is really incredible. And that's a way that technology moves forward very quickly also. And so I think, we have both of these things going on where we're watching things and trying to compete, but we're also helping each other and moving the discourse forward that way.
Yeah. Okay, we have a question up there. Maybe while the mic is getting up there, I want to just ask another question. So there's the quantified self movement. Davis Maston, who's involved in that, I don't know where Davis is, but is looking at developing apps that basically are connecting to how your body's performing. And it makes me think, as I look at these planning apps, that we're very quickly getting to a point where people will be able to see the impact of a planning decision on themselves. Not just on their land, but on their health, their human health, the health of their property, what have you. I mean, do you see that coming?
Well, there's so many implications for public health from these accessibility metrics.
Exactly.
In addition to all the economic things I talked about, I mean, public health is, just so many diseases can be prevented by providing environments that allow people to get their basic exercise done on a daily basis.
Exactly.
So
yeah,
there's fantastic connections there, and it'd be really interesting actually to see that tracked in real time.
Right.
Or at least annually or something like that, if there's some sort of performance management approach where you track the actual development that happens, the change in these accessibility performance measures, and then you have reports on people's fitness and activity.
Well, how did that affect you personally?
That'd be great.
Yes, up here.
Hi, thank you, Brian Runk, University of Minnesota. So going back to the crowdsourced discussion of all these different designs and the potentially contested nature of people's visioning, I'm just wondering, is there an increased risk of polarization that we could contribute to problems, going about it in this crowdsourced manner? Two, what other risks are kind of involved in taking these approach? And then third, how are we going to go about managing these risks if we have this hunch that there might be some?
I'll go jump in and say I'm not at all worried about the risk you're talking about that you started with. I think there are some other risks which I'll talk about, but I think just the opposite, that my experience, I got into this not because I'm not a software engineer, but I got into this because I do run a lot of meetings and I do a lot of public engagement. And my experience over the last 25 years is definitely that the more people talk, the more that they can hear from each other, the more that they can feel like they're being heard, the more that they can give input, the less there is polarization, and the more people are able to reach agreements. So I see these as platforms by which we're just exponentially increasing the avenues by which people can talk to each other and engage with each other and ultimately come to consensus. The more they know, the more likely they are to come to consensus. One of the things I always talk about is the six blind men and the elephant, and one touches the leg and thinks it's like a tree, and one touches the trunk and thinks it's like a snake, one touches the ear and thinks it's like a fan, and none of them know what an elephant is. But if you can show them all those parts, then they all suddenly get a picture of what this whole thing is. And the way all our planning works is one person is concerned about health, and one person is concerned about moving traffic, and one person is concerned about economics. And none of them have talked to each other thought about the other things. And if we can bring them all together, then they start being able to reach agreements together, and I see these as tools to do that. So I see very little risk there. I do think there's two related risks. One I already mentioned, and they both have to do with data overload. Or data, the way data works. One is that we're going to make it possible for ourselves to get so much input that I think we're not going to really know what to do with it. And we already have that situation. I mean, you hear about an environmental impact statement that got 12,000 comments. You know, and if you get 12,000, or comment letters, right? And each comment letter has actually 5 or 6 comments in it. And we've set up this system, you know, no decision maker can read through 12,000 letters and really understand what they are, what all those people thought. So you have to come up with a way to re-aggregate them into simpler messages that are representative but true. And Carl, I'm glad you're going to tell us how to do that later. So that's one issue, is the data overload. The other thing is that as everybody becomes increasingly sophisticated, they do start to question our methods. You know, the black box, you can't just have a black box anymore. You'll have, particularly if you work in Menlo Park or Mountain View or Livermore or Berkeley, which is where all our clients are. You know, we have 12 rocket scientists at every meeting, and they all think that they know as much about planning as we do. And so they will question everything we do, and they want to know, well, really, what is that algorithm, and why does that bar move up and down right now? And I'm not sure I believe all that. And so we do have a risk, if you will, of needing to really have very defensible algorithms and methodologies, and really being able to be open to other people coming to us and say, well, I think you should look at it this way, and here's a different indicator that I'd like you to consider.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I agree with what David said. I'm not terribly worried about the risks, honestly. I mean, I think that the dialogues that we've had, the encounters that we've had have shown us that the data actually tends to reconcile polarized views, because otherwise you're just stuck in your own experience, you know? You don't have anything to pull yourself out of your lived life and, you know, kind of take that bird's eye view, or just go, hang on a second, whoa, wait, you know, if I step outside of myself for a second, then it's this, you know? And so it really does provide a common language that tends to reconcile. I think the truth sets you free more often than not. And we did hear a little bit of concern or anxiety from like that volunteer committee. They were like, but wait, what if this says that we're actually doing great and our bicycle accessibility is excellent and we don't need to do anything? That's the opposite of what we want to do, because we want to push the town to do more. And ultimately they just said, no, we're still curious. We just want to know. You know, people are so curious about what, you know, the data will actually tell them, that I think they're willing to overcome that anxiety, that there's a risk that their own personal agenda will be overwhelmed by it. And then that just pushes everybody forward towards focusing on the problem rather than an agenda. You know?
Yeah.
So.
Let's see, we have a question here.
Yes, I'm David Moss from Maricopa County in Phoenix, Arizona. So I was wondering, from the standpoint of the crowdsourcing data and also using some of the local government data, which may or may not be in the best standards or a little siloed, do you guys give the option of being able to combine those two to kind of get a better data source? And then 2, what do you guys see in the professions of the typical planner who may or may not know how these new applications and this new technology works? Because we always deal in the issue of in local government, this is the way I've always been doing it. I was taught this way when I started. And so it's kind of hard to get some folks to change to that new method of thinking.
Is it okay if I?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So as far as combining crowdsourced and local proprietary data, that is a big part of the strategy. I mentioned the Google kind of crowdsourced, because it's really like crowdsourced from multiple agencies, but really each of those agencies is publishing their proprietary data in this GTFS format. But then there's also bike data, and that is truly crowdsourced on typically like OpenStreetMap is the main platform for sharing what are the bike lanes and things like that. And we can bring that again also into the ArcGIS platform into this. But then when you look at like sidewalks, there isn't as much of an active kind of savvy community on walking that's submitting like, oh, here's where the sidewalks are in OpenStreetMap. So that data really needs to come from the town engineer or public works department's sidewalk inventory. That's really, really at the local level where that is. So it has to be a blend of all of these things. And then we've got, the best data for street routing, street networks, routable networks is proprietary. A company called Here that's an Esri partner as well. So it's really a blend of all of these things. It's not just one thing. It's not like crowdsourcing is this magic bullet that just solves every problem. And if you're trying to do something multimodal, you need a mixture of approaches. On the kind of evolution of skills and awareness of technology, that's where we find ESRI and ArcGIS to be tremendously helpful, because it's so ubiquitous in local government, quite frankly, that if you can get the tools into the environment and the platform that the planners know, or at least they have a staff person who knows that platform, you have a much easier time than if you just kind of have some black box tool that's like this brand new application they've got to learn to understand. So we really find ArcGIS is kind of the gateway to a whole broad range of applications that can help local government planners move forward.
David?
Only thing I'd add, which I think is only tangentially related, but to give a plug, and you probably know this, I mean, I think all of you who are working in cities or larger organizations, local government, you need to get out of those silos, because you have so much GIS now that's being generated and created in a variety of departments, and those departments aren't all talking to each other. We have this very interesting position as consultants. We come in and we don't know any better, so we call all the different departments, and we often find out that all these departments have all this great data, and they didn't know that the one next door had other data that they could be using, and when we bring it all together. So, Maricopa County or wherever all of you are, I hope that you're at this point looking at an organization-wide GIS manager of some sort who does have overview and has some authority over the GIS groups within each traditional department or division, and can build those bridges and find ways to make data accessible across departments and across uses, so that because it has usefulness from one department to another, and they've got to let it go to let the other people get at it.
Sort of following on that, do you see these tools actually leading to, in some sense, reorganization of local governments around places as opposed to all of these sort of dysfunctional or departments that we've inherited from the past?
Well, what I have been tracking is the trend towards new positions being identified, like director of sustainability, or another one is it is cross-cutting, and another one is director of performance management. And there are performance management departments at forward-thinking cities, and I forgot to mention that earlier. But performance management is taking analytics and data-driven decision-making, and a lot of it is geographic, and mining open data, mining transactional data that comes out of city businesses. I'm looking at 511 calls, trash collection, all this stuff, and seeing how can we provide city services more efficiently, and then translating that into organizational recommendations and forward-thinking planning measures and forecasts and things like that. So, I mean, it's not happening at every city, at every local government, but that is a trend that's emerging, and it's very interesting.
Yeah.
I guess my answer, what I think is going to emerge is sort of a matrix organization. I mean, I think running a police department is always going to be different from running a sewer line, right? So you can't say to one person, your job is to run policing and sewer system in that place, in that neighborhood. But I think what you can do is you can say, as the police or the sewer people, your job is just to do that thing. And if you need geoinformatics, or if you need sustainability, or you must have sustainability, and you're going to respond to this other host of people who are working across this other dimension, and they're in charge of both, giving you help to fulfill certain goals in sustainability or performance, and they're also in charge of giving you services, in charge of, and most cities already have that, they have somebody who's in charge of all the copiers, right, and all the copy machines. So it's not like every, you don't have, your secretary doesn't have to be in charge of fixing your copy machine, you call somebody central. And I think we're going to see that more and more for GIS and for sustainability and for all sorts of things.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. We have time for maybe one more question. Any? Up here? Over here, yes.
Hi, Kim Coventry from the Richard H. Driehaus Foundation in Chicago. I was just thinking that another place where you might see compression or consolidation is in the not-for-profits that work on built environment issues and concerns. And if they were, I find also coming to me with proposals for projects that are very similar and they're not having a dialogue. And this information, this data is a place where they might find that they have a common goals and consolidate and compress, and then thereby reduce the number of projects that these not-for-profits are funding or overlap in these projects. If they were able to share this information and work along these same models, using these same software, I think it's an area where we're going to see compression and maybe some merging of these organizations. So that'll have an impact on the cities as well in terms of the amount of funding that's available to a given project or for a given cause or advocacy.
Interesting.
Very interesting,
Thoughts?
yeah.
Yeah, hadn't thought about that, but you're absolutely right. That's great, Kim. Maybe one more? Any other questions? Oh, way in the back. Yeah. We're just about to lunchtime, so.
Hi, my name's Cameron from Culver City, and so we've been talking about like smart cities. We have this idea of smart cities and combining like urban design, transportation, public health, and I was just wondering what you guys' thoughts were on cities with sensors and like tracking people's movements and like grid networks in emerging cities. Because I know India is doing building 100 smart cities. They have a plan to build like 100 smart cities, and I know Chicago is using sensors to track people's movements. Do you think that'll be an influence on the data we use, or how do you propose we use that data?
I think it's, Colby was talking before about the sources of data. We had the question about that, and I think that is going to increasingly be a source of data. I think what's happening in this country is not that we're going to build new smart cities, but our cities are just becoming smart in that sense that there is technology deployed everywhere. We've got it on the freeways, we've got it on the local roadways, we've got cams that are watching things, we've got things that are counting all sorts of movements and activities, and all of that data is more and more available as one of the data sources that we can use to go into the analysis that happens to assess these alternatives or to assess future scenarios. So that's absolutely going to be there. I don't think there's going to come a time where somebody's going to just say, we now did this smart city project, so much as it's going to be this gradual evolution over time.
And
Short time.
it is smart to use the data that's being generated
Right.
by our, what happened was basically IT extended its reach into every area of city services, into every area of infrastructure, into everything we do. And GIS did as well, by the way. And so real-time data is now being logged and stored in databases all the time as transactions are occurring and people are going about their business and city services are being provided. It's smart to mine that data. It is. What I want to caution the room about is there is sometimes a tendency to view that as a panacea. As if we just treat this like an optimization problem and run an algorithm that's constantly optimizing in real time what we're doing and reacting and making things more efficient as we're distributing city services or running the transportation network, it's great. It'll just solve itself. Our problems with traffic congestion will go away. You just throw some ITS, intelligent transportation systems, at it and problem solved. What we know from our field, transportation planning, is that will only get you to a local optimum. In other words, if you think of the landscape of possibilities of outcomes as being kind of like the hills outside,
right.
This room, if you look outside, there's mountains over here, and then we're in a valley here, and you're trying to climb to the peak, right? Well, you might get up to the closest hill, but you're not going to get to the highest point in the mountain range that way. What you need in order to do that is to actually get a map of the entire terrain and go, oh, I want to be there. So instead of just climbing, in the direction of steepest gradient where I am right now, I'm going to go over here down the road a little bit and climb that mountain. And to do that, you need more forward-thinking tools that are not just locally optimizing real-time current conditions, but actually looking further ahead, more long range.
Colby, that's one of the best descriptions I've heard recently. And why geodesign? I mean, GIS analytics can get you partway up that hill, but if you want to get to the top, if you want to see the whole, you actually need these geodesign methods and these geodesign tools, which is fabulous. Well, great. Thank you both. This was terrific. And we're at lunchtime. So lunch is in the cafe across the road, and we'll be back here at 1:30. Yeah, thank you.